Welcome to the Neurokrish Immersion. In this podcast, we are going to delve into a really interesting theme, 5 facets of the political mind. In this, we dive deep into the psychology behind political thinking. We explore not just what people believe, but why they believe it, tracing the cognitive, emotional, social, moral, and power-driven roots of our political minds. Picture this. Every day, millions of us people around the world consume political news, form and shape political beliefs, and develop political opinions. Indeed, we engage in heated discussions. Yet, for the vast majority of us, our interest in the domain of politics is likely to stay academic, and we may never, in actual fact, practice politics. So why then does this subject influence and preoccupy our minds? This podcast seeks to explore also what lies beneath our political affiliations and how they emerge from a complex psychological framework. When it comes to politics, a good proportion of us have opinions. We may look to the left, the right, or indeed dead center. We must recognize and acknowledge, however, that politics is omnipresent, from media to personal relationships, and political leanings often reflect deeper motivations beyond policy. What makes a person conservative or liberal? This has been an academic question in the US for years and years. What scientists have proposed, based on research, is that conservatives value tradition, stability, and are threat sensitive. Liberals favor change, empathy, and openness to ambiguity. Psychological and neurological studies support these tendencies, showing differences in how conservatives and liberals process information and respond to threat. In 1968, a debate was held between the conservative thinker William F. Buckley Jr. and liberal writer Gore Vidal. It was hoped that these two members of opposing intellectual elites would show Americans living through tumultuous times that political disagreements could be civilized. That idea did not last long. Instead, Buckley and Vidal descended rapidly into name-calling. Afterward, they sued each other for defamation. Thus begins an episode on an article on conservative and liberal minds and the differences in Scientific American. The story of the 1968 debate opens a well-researched 2013 book called Predisposed, which introduced the general public to the field of political neuroscience. The authors, a trio of political scientists in the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and Rice University, argued that if the differences between liberals and conservatives seem profound and even unbridgeable, it is because they are rooted in personality characteristics and biological predispositions. On the whole, the research seems to show that conservatives desire security, predictability, and authority more than liberals do, and liberals are more comfortable with novelty, nuance, and complexity. If you had put Buckley and Vidal in a magnetic resonance imaging machine and presented them with identical images, you would likely have seen differences in their brain, especially in the areas that process social and emotional information. And if you have access to it, I would ask you to watch the podcast with the slide guide, because we do have images that are helpful. The volume of grey matter or neural cell bodies making up the anterior cingulate cortex, an area that helps to detect errors and resolve conflicts, tends to be larger in liberals. And the amygdala, which is important for regulating emotions and evaluating threats, is larger in conservatives. This is the finding in neuroscience. Going back to history, we have interesting contrasts of a different nature. Think about Machiavelli, the realist, and think about Plato and his king, his ideal king, Plato the philosopher. Machiavellism is a personality trait characterized by manipulativeness, deceitfulness, high levels of self-interest, and a tendency to see each other people as a means to an end. People who display especially elevated levels of Machiavellism, referred to by some psychologists as high max, lack empathy and take a cynical, unemotional view of the world. Their primary interests center on power and status, and they'll do whatever is necessary to achieve their goals. This trait was named for Niccolo Machiavelli, a 16th century author and political philosopher who argued in works like The Prince that kings and other rulers should do whatever is necessary to seize and maintain their power. Today, some evidence suggests that people high in Machiavellism are more likely to pursue high-power careers such as politics or law. Machiavellism, along with narcissism and psychopathy, make up a collection of unpleasant and closely related personality traits known as the dark triad. Now, contrast this with Plato's notion of the philosopher king. What he said was that the philosopher is the only person who can be trusted to rule well. Philosophers are both morally and intellectually suited to rule, morally because it is their nature to love truth and learning so much that they are free from greed and lust that tempts others to abuse power, and intellectually because they alone can gain full knowledge of reality, which in books 5 through 7 of the Republic is argued to culminate in knowledge of the forms of virtue, beauty, and above all, the good. The city can foster such knowledge by putting aspiring philosophers through a demanding education, and the philosophers will use their knowledge of goodness and virtue to help other citizens achieve these so far as possible. Thus spoke Plato. Now, beyond these historical concepts, let's come back to think about the political mind and its 5 facets. Cognition is one facet, emotion another, social identity the third, morality the fourth, and power the fifth. These 5 dimensions act in concert to shape how people engage with politics. Each represents a lens through which political behavior can be interpreted. Let's look at the cognitive mind. The cognitive mind includes various cognitive biases like confirmation bias, the Dunning-Kruger effect, and the backfire effect. Brains in general prefer shortcuts over nuance, and therefore these biases that we have affect how we process political information and reinforce pre-existing beliefs. The confirmation bias describes our underlying tendency to notice, focus, or give greater credence to evidence that fits with our existing beliefs. Think about how you consume the news, or think about how you consume social media. We tend to pick things that fit in with our own frame of thinking. That is our confirmation bias. On the other hand, in a perfectly rational world, people who encounter evidence that challenges their beliefs would first evaluate this evidence and then adjust their beliefs accordingly. However, in reality, this is seldom the case. And when people encounter evidence that should cause them to doubt their beliefs, they often reject this evidence and strengthen their support for their original stance. In other words, we dig our heels in when we are confronted with information that is uncomfortable to us and information that is contrary to our beliefs. This is called the backfire effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect, on the other hand, occurs when a person's lack of knowledge and skill in a certain area causes them to overestimate their own competence. By contrast, this effect also drives those who excel in a given area to think the task is simple for everyone, leading them to underestimate other people's abilities. To give you an example, very often you'll find politicians shooting their mouth off about something that they don't know too much about. And what they are engaging in is the Dunning-Kruger effect. So just to remind you, there is a neuroscience of ideology Conservatives have heightened amygdala activity. The amygdala is the part of the brain that is responsible for emotion and threat perception. And the liberals have a active anterior cingulate cortex, a part of the brain that's important for decision making and evaluating situations. These neurological distinctions help explain ideological inclinations and the resistance also to opposing views. What also happens, of course, is that we live in an era, and perhaps this has predated even the current era, of echo chambers and polarization. Today, we have algorithmic filtering that reinforces our biases, and social media is a polarization accelerators. Thus, these platforms deepen divides among us, shielding users from contrary perspectives and elevating emotionally charged content. A study in Scientific Reports talks about opinion and amplification and how it causes extreme polarization in social networks. In this study, Lim and Bentley point out that extreme polarization of opinions fuel many of the problems facing our societies today, from issues on human rights to the environment. Social media provides the vehicle for these opinions and enables the spread of ideas faster than before. They say that previous computational models have suggested that significant external events can induce extreme polarization. But they go on to introduce a social opinion amplification model, SOAM, to investigate an alternative hypothesis that opinion amplification can result in extreme polarization. And they point out that SOAM models effects such as sensationalism, hype, or fake news as people express amplified versions of their actual opinions, motivated by a desire to gain a greater following, show that these things result in extreme polarization, especially when the degree of amplification is small. And they point out that two methods, preventing individuals from amplifying more than a certain number of times and through consistent dissemination of balanced opinions, you can actually prevent polarization. They conclude by saying it is natural to try and have the loudest voice in a crowd when we seek attention. But this work that we've done suggests that instead of shouting to be heard and generating an uproar, it's better for all if we speak with moderation. Let's move on to talk now about the emotional mind. There are three key emotions that seem to drive politics: fear, anger, and hope. And these emotions not only influence voting behavior but also shape entire political events. In politics, words are weapons, tools, and instruments of persuasion. Political narratives are carefully crafted to evoke emotions that can influence public opinions, shape ideologies, and mobilize actions. Whether through speeches, debates, social media posts, or policy discussions, politicians and their strategists use emotionally charged language to craft compelling messages that voters easily and quickly absorb. But why are emotionally charged words so effective, and how do they shape the political discourse? Emotionally charged words, or words with emotional burdens, are those that evoke strong feelings, whether positive or negative. These words can trigger reactions based on personal values, fears, hopes, and experiences. Psychologists suggest that a language laden with emotions involves the amygdala, which is the brain's emotional processing center and which makes information less likely to be forgotten and more persuasive. Daniel Kahneman explains in Thinking Fast and Slow that emotionally charged words tap into System 1 thinking, our fast, instinctive, and emotional mode of data processing, instead of System 2, which is slower and more analytical. Political messages often attempt to circumvent critical scrutiny by directly appealing to emotions, thus making emotions a powerful rhetorical device. Fear is one of the most commonly used emotions in political communication. Politicians often highlight threats, real or perceived, to create urgency and mobilize support. For example, the Daisy commercial of President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964 depicted a nuclear explosion and was warning the voters of the dangers of electing his opponent, Barry Goldwater. The ad successfully exploited fear to influence voter perceptions. More recently, political leaders from around the world have used fear-based rhetoric to deal with immigration, terrorism, and economic instability. Terms like invasion, criminals, and radical extremists have been used to shape public attitudes towards national security and immigration policies, especially in the West. Hope is also a very powerful emotion because it often does provide a vision for the future. Politicians use optimistic language to inspire and unite people around a cause. Good examples are Barack Obama's 2008 campaign slogan, "Yes, we can," which was a great example of using positive, emotionally charged words to evoke feelings of emancipation and collective progress, and Franklin Roosevelt's assurance during the Great Depression, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," used rousing rhetoric to instill hope and resilience in Americans. Anger is also a powerful motivator, especially in populist movements. Political leaders use anger-filled words to rally supporters against perceived injustices. The Occupy Wall Street movement, for example, used the phrase "we are the 99% to highlight economic inequality, sparking widespread frustration against corporate elites and government policies. More recently, Donald Trump's rhetoric about fake news has also fueled distrust in institutions, mobilizing a base that feels alienated from mainstream politics. The way political issues are therefore framed or presented influences how people perceive them. Framing involves selecting certain aspects of reality and emphasizing them through specific linguistic formulations. Emotionally charged words play a key role in this process. For example, when taxation is described as a burden or a job killer, it is viewed negatively. In contrast, calling it an investment in our future or a contribution to society frames it in a positive light. The linguistic frame influences how the public interprets policy proposals and political decisions. Thus, emotions and the emotional mind have a great role to play in politics, and we have several examples of fear, hope, anger, all contributing to the political discourse, and effectively so. The third facet is the social mind. All of us have our identity rooted in groups, family, religion, and nation. We all espouse in-group loyalty, and some of us also may have challenges with out-of-group hostility. Modern political affiliations reflect ancient social dynamics where community and survival are interlinked. So, how does tribalism affect our social brain? One fascinating aspect of the brain is its inherent social nature. We are wired to think and thrive in social contexts and seek connections with others. Neuroscientists have extensively studied this phenomenon and identified several neural mechanisms that underlie our social behavior. Tribalism refers to humans forming social groups and identifying with them, driven by shared identity, values, and goals. Research has shown that perceiving others as part of our group activates the brain's reward system, fostering loyalty and preference. Perceiving others as part of our group activates the brain's empathy circuit, promoting compassion and cooperation. Thus, your brain is wired to respond to these positive feelings that are evoked by feeling of community, feeling of clan, feeling of group, and so on. There are other factors that play a role. A study conducted at UCLA observed increased activity in certain parts of the brain, the ventral striatum and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, regions associated with reward and value processing. The findings suggest that the brain perceives group identity as rewarding and valuable, shedding light on the neural mechanisms of tribalism. Additionally, the release of oxytocin and vasopressin affects sensory information processing, enhancing social recognition memory, and further linking group identity to pleasurable and rewarding experiences. I'll take the opportunity to remind you of the podcast on the art, culture, and science of love, where these reward mechanisms have been talked about very, very extensively earlier. We have mirror neurons in our premotor cortex and inferior parietal lobule, and these facilitate understanding of others' intentions and emotions, promoting empathy. They are vital for social cognition, including imitation, social learning, and predicting behavior. Mirror neurons also foster social bonds, synchronizing our actions and generating shared emotions, enhancing social interaction. Thus, the neuroscience of tribalism, if you ask the question, why is your brain tribal? The brain's reward and empathy system has a role in group identity, loyalty, compassion, and cooperation. Mirror neurons contribute to social cognition, empathy, and social bonding. Oxytocin influences social bonding and in-group or out-of-group bias. And I think it's very important to remember that these neuroscientific mechanisms have a role to play in how our social brain is tribal. Group loyalty is therefore an evolutionary trait, and political identity offers certainty and belonging. Tribalism strengthens in polarized climates where disagreement becomes enmity and political affiliation becomes a core part of personal identity. And this is all perhaps why people become politically tribal. Political narratives are often built in order to build this collective identity, and threats to identity lead to extremism. And here we have challenges of cancel culture, ideological rigidity, and social polarization, all of which emerge when identity is central and threatened. If you look at recent examples from around the globe, Brexit, when the British public decided to vote themselves out of the European Union, was a classic case of an identity conflict coming to the fore. Today, the liberal and conservatives in America and in many parts of the world are deeply divided. Another example of identity conflicts coming to the fore. And in India, for years, we have had caste and regional politics that have shaped many political dynasties. And once again, tribalism and our social brains is what leads to us engaging in these type of behaviors where we ally with some people and we reject others very, very strongly. The fourth facet is the moral mind. There is the moral foundations theory which we will talk about, but again, the liberals espouse care and fairness, the conservatives loyalty, authority, and sanctity. Moral frameworks often underlie our judgments and often act as the unseen architecture of political belief. The moral foundations theory posits 5 evolved psychological mechanisms that combine in various ways to produce rapid, intuitive, evaluative judgments, and explains differences in political orientation in terms of the differential reliance on these foundations. Liberals tend to form judgments influenced predominantly by 2 or 3 of the foundations: care, fairness, and perhaps liberty, whereas conservatives tend to form judgments influenced by all of them, including especially loyalty, authority, and sanctity. Do morals influence political ideology, or indeed does political ideology influence your moral structure? This is the question that 3 political scientists set out to test, and they found that the evidence did not support the dominant interpretation of the moral foundation theory, according to which the causal explanatory relationship runs from morality to politics. In other words, your morality influences your politics. If anything, they suggest that political ideology influences moral judgments and not the other way around. Moreover, political ideologies appear more stable than moral foundations and are more strongly predictive of them than the reverse. So, interestingly, rather than the way we used to think, the moral foundation theory, the direction of affiliation may be from the political to the moral, exactly the opposite of what we used to think. There is a politics of right and wrong, therefore, and competing moral priorities fuel debates. Justice, fairness, and freedom, all of which are interpreted differently based on underlying moral values, often lead to intractable disagreements in our population. Let's come to that very controversial topic of religion and political morality. We do know that religion informs our moral political worldviews, and definitely based on which religion we are affiliated to, there are very strong influences. Religious values provide ethical frameworks. They add depth and complexity to political decision making. So what are the foundations of this relationship between religion and politics? There is the old concept of the separation of church and state. Nevertheless, if you think about it, even with this separation, one religion may be privileged over others. For example, when a leader is installed, the predominant religion has a larger role to play than other religions in most examples, most cultures, most countries. Toleration and accommodation of religious beliefs and practices can be challenging. For example, in a secular culture, when there is a religion that prohibits even blood drawing as part of a life-saving procedure, now the religion is in conflict to the values of that society, of that culture. And this therefore causes inherent conflicts. Liberalism and its demands on private self-understanding can be another area of challenge. A religious citizen could feel an acute conflict between her identity, qua citizen, and qua religious. Religious reasons also are part of public deliberation. And proponents of the idea that suitable reasons for public deliberation does not include certain doctrines have come to be known as exclusivists and their opponents as inclusivists. So once again, religion, when considered politically, if is not fully accepted into public deliberation, there are huge challenges. So religion does have an impact on morality and how we think about morality. Religion does have an impact on our politics and how we think about our politics. And of course, politics and morality have their own relationship. We then look at power and the dynamics of power and how they shape politics. Power drives behavior and narratives. Its pursuit and preservation are central to political maneuvering. Experiments and propaganda illustrate its influence. In political science, power is the ability to influence or direct the actions, beliefs, or conduct of an actor. Power does not exclusively refer to the threat or use of force, so it's not about coercion, but by one actor against another, but may also be exerted through diffuse means such as institutions. Power can also take structural forms as it orders actors in relation to one another, such as distinguishing between an employer and their employees, as categories and language may lend legitimacy to some behaviors and groups over the others. The term authority is often used for power that is perceived as legitimate or socially approved by the social structure. And scholars have distinguished between soft power and hard power. Power is therefore rather complex as a phenomenon. A notable study of power conducted by social psychologists French and Raven in 1959 talked about the 5 bases of power. Coercive power uses the threat of force to gain compliance from another. Reward power is based on the right of some to offer or deny tangible, social, emotional, or spiritual rewards to others for doing what is expected of them. Legitimate power comes from an elected, selected, or appointed position of authority and may be underpinned by social norms. Referent power is rooted in the affiliations we make or in the groups and organizations we belong to. Expert power is based on what one knows, experiences, and the special talents or skills. So coercive power, for example, is what a bully would use, a political bully would use in order to control his constituency. Reward power is what is often used either by offering a reward in exchange for someone doing what you want them to do, or indeed withholding a reward when they do not do what you want them to do. And of course, this can be used in a range of circumstances in politics. Legitimacy of power comes from being elected or appointed. So someone who is a legislator, for example, has legitimate power. A priest, for example, has legitimate power. Referent power is because we make common cause with others and because we form communal groups. The power that emerges by being part of such a grouping is referent power. And expert power is the kind of power that knowledge and experience and special skills or talents confers upon people. Raven subsequently added in 1965 informational power. Informational power is the ability of an agent of influence to bring about change through the resource of information. Power can be manifested in so many different ways. If you think about Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, they demonstrated to the world the power of non-violence. If you think about Putin, the current Russian president, and Xi, the current Chinese president, they demonstrate to the world the power of authoritarianism. Media has a huge role in shaping power, and we do know that. And we have a very good example of a current president in the United States wielding power, and in some ways rather effectively, in some ways which we don't really understand. So these examples show contrasting uses of power, some rooted in moral authority and some in control and surveillance. So the 5 facets of the political mind as we've looked at them: the cognitive facets, the emotional facets, the social identity facets, the morality facets, and the power facets. And these 5 dimensions act in concert to shape how people engage with politics. Each represents a lens through which political behavior can be interpreted. So can we escape our political minds? Politics is just not about laws and policies. It's rooted in how we think, feel, belong, judge, and seek control. By becoming aware of our biases and identities, we can strive for more open and less reactive political discourse. True political wisdom may not lie in escaping our political minds, but in recognizing that these minds are not just personal. They are shaped by power. They are also shaped by influence. And in a time like this, they are greatly shaped by social media and the amplification of certain belief systems. Understanding this is the first step towards genuine political clarity. Let me leave you with a question. What shapes your own politics? Is it logic or is it identity? Let this question linger as you examine your own beliefs. The journey to understanding begins with curiosity. Remember, all of us operate with some bias. Thank you.